From New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire, you're listening to Check This Out, a series where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. I'm your host, Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. I am thrilled to be able to share these conversations with you. We have a brand new slate of exciting books and authors coming your way this fall. Today, my guest is Morgan Talty, author of the brand new debut, Fire Exit. This novel is set on and around Maine's Penobscot Reservation, on the banks of a river that stands as a physical division between the life the protagonist, Charles, wants and the life he has. The river is also symbolic of the deep rift he feels between how he was raised and how he's living, and also the rift and deep emotions dividing the community and characters in this book. Charles, the main character, is white by blood and Penobscot by culture. He grew up on the reservation with a white mother and a Penobscot stepfather. As a white man who didn't marry into the tribe, he has to leave at the age of 18. It's not an easy or clean separation. This book is about family, regret, and politics on the Penobscot Reservation. It's also about memory, the shifting nature of memory and bloodlines. Blood that can be a stain, a tie, and something that defines us. These are heavy themes, and it can be dark, but through it all, Charles has an optimism, a hope for a better future that kept me turning the page. The question I kept asking after I put this book down: what does it mean to belong and not belong at the same time? I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I'm so excited to have you here today as my guest, Morgan. Welcome to Check This Out.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to talk about Fire Exit, the book, and even the context in which it's situated. There's so much to say.
Yes, even in a 1-hour show, we're going to have to try to pack it all in. So there are a lot of ways to summarize this book. I tried to sit down and put it in one sentence or even two sentences. There's a father-daughter story. There's a story about family secrets. There are also storylines around the nature of memory and storytelling and bloodline and blood. And I just wasn't exactly sure. I thought, I need to ask Morgan, how do you describe this book when someone says to you, what is Fire Exit about? What do you say?
I say I had my editor write the synopsis because I could not do it. I, too, am like, how do you describe this narrative? But I've come to kind of basically say, it's this man who grew up on the reservation and because his mother had married in, and at the age of 18, since he was not native, he had to leave the reservation, but he was in love he cared very much about this woman he grew up with who was 25% native blood. And to be a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, the eligibility is 25%. And so they ended up having a child. And in order for the child to be technically considered Penobscot instead of a descendant and have all the benefits and rights afforded to her, the mother lies and says that the child belongs to a native man. She gets put on the census, and Charles has watched from across the river, just coincidentally, it just so happened to be where his stepfather had helped him build, watched his daughter grow up. And it picks up there, the opening line with, I wanted the girl to know the truth. And this story is this tug and pull of a man who exists but does not exist. And he's holding two ropes. One in his left hand is his daughter, who he wants to tell the truth. And then the other is his mother, who's slipping away from dementia and who blames him for her husband and his stepfather's death. And so he's having to be pulled back and forth between these two people who are related and don't even know it. It's the burden of a secret over all of these years because of federal Indian law and because of identity and because of racism and all sorts of things. So that's sort of how I describe it. It's a book that, as the title says, Fire Exit. It's like we should all be running for the exits and thinking about maybe how do we get this fire out that is, happening not just in this book, but everywhere, I think. I think everybody can relate to feeling like they have a sense of belonging and that they also don't at the same time.
Yeah. But also you're really struggling, I think, to describe one of the issues in the book, too, which is about what is the truth?
Yeah.
And do you always have to tell the truth?
Yeah. And that's one of the things Charles is faced with throughout the book is he wavers, back and forth at times, should I tell her? Should I not? We never actually see him commit to actively telling her, because he doesn't do it, right? Like, oh, the spoiler, sorry. But through a series of events, it just so happens, right? Like that, what he wants, he gets, but he doesn't do it. It's fascinating. And it's not really a spoiler, I guess, but if you read the book or haven't read the book, I haven't ruined anything giant for you.
Yeah, so before we dig too much more into the plot and the characters, I just want to start by saying that this book felt very personal. And I was wondering if you could explain your connection to Maine's Penobscot Reservation.
Yeah, I mean, my connection to it is, so I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and there was the Indian Relocation Act, which encouraged indigenous people to leave the reservation or their homelands to go find work in cities. And that's why there are so many natives in urban areas. And my grandmother, we weren't federally recognized until 1980. You know, we didn't get that, but it was still, we were state recognized.
We being who?
The Penobscot Nation and the Passamaquoddy and Micmac and Maliseet, which make up the Wabanaki in Maine. Wabanaki meaning people of the dawn. So we weren't federally recognized, but we were state recognized. And I believe the state encouraged that policy as well. And so a lot of us somehow wound up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Like, I don't know why. So I grew up there, but my mom brought me up here after troubles with my dad and financial drug and addiction and stuff like that, and brought me up to the reservation when I was like 5 or 6. And I'd been before, though. I'd come up to see family and things, so I'd always known of the place. And then I spent the rest of my life growing up there, and it had always felt like home. I think my connection to it, even though I don't even live there anymore now, like I still feel like I'm on the reservation in a way, even though it's a half-hour drive.
Do you still have family living on the reservation?
Yeah, you know, when if you're a teenager and you go home and you're like, tell your parents, you're like, oh, I started dating so and so, they'll be like, oh, well, that's your cousin. Like, it's just a small knit community, and it'll be like a third or fourth cousin, you know, but they do it to tease you. But yeah, I have family there. My aunt lives there. My uncle lives there. Some of my cousins live there. My grandmother had lived there up until her passing. Yeah, so I have family.
I thought it was fascinating that this book is about the reservation, the Penobscot Nation, but it's told from a white point of view. The main character, Charles, is white, and he belongs but doesn't belong because he grew up there, but he had to leave. So why did you choose that perspective, given that you grew up or have such a strong attachment to that land?
I mean, yes, I made the deliberate choice to have the narrator be, you know, this white person who grew up and was raised in the same way everybody else was raised. I grew up personally on the reservation with kids whose parents had married in, and they were not native. They just weren't. But they went to school with us. We have a school on the reservation that goes up to 8th grade. So, like, they studied our language with us. They studied Native studies with us. Looking back, I'm like, wow, they did better than me grade-wise. And it's just a funny, like, juxtaposition, right? You know, to think about. But they had to leave. And, like, this was in a driving reason for writing this book. But I just wonder how they feel. Do they feel like where they grew up abandoned them? And I'm not, this book is not to blame tribes or at all. This book is to just draw attention to the fact that we are stuck in a system that is possible to break free from, and that we can come up with alternative ways to create a stronger sense of belonging. And it doesn't always have to do with blood. Like, it just doesn't. Nobody measures your amount of blood to be an American. Nobody measures your amount of blood to be a Canadian. It doesn't make any sense, but that's the requirement.
What we're really touching on, maybe talking around a little bit, is the historic term usage, the invention of blood quantum as, something that arose in history as a way to define who might be who. Can you talk about that, blood quantum, and what that means?
Yeah, so blood quantum came out of the colony of Virginia in 1704 or 5, one of those years. And the colony of Virginia was founded in 1600s by John Smith, the John Smith and Pocahontas story that we all know, right? And blood quantum was actually not the main focus. It was originally used in the context of slavery and to maintain property for slave owners. And basically it was so white people could rape black women, and if it was a son, to make sure the son didn't inherit any of the land. So if there was even an inkling of blackness in you, you were full black. And that's how they kept it in line so property remained where it was supposed to be. And I mean, it was all about the patriarchy. It was all about men wanting to get what they want, which was money, land, and sex. Like that was it, and take it. But they recognized at the same time, they're like, this like idea of having a drop of something in you. Then they flipped the coin over and they were like, oh, well, we could do that with native people, right? Because native people were in a unique situation in that the land they had at that time, it was, depending where you were, there were certain ways you could go about acquiring land, like buying it, for example, and the lands belonged to a government entity. But if you could create a system in which you could somehow diminish nativeness while not killing the person, why not, they thought? So they implemented it. It made its way into Indian country, and eventually when tribes had to keep track of membership to maintain their standing as a tribe, they had to have eligibility requirements. And so most tribes just defaulted to blood quantum. About 70% of tribes use it. Others use patrilineal or matrilineal. Those even have their problems as well. And so it started in 1704, but even the idea of it might exist elsewhere earlier on in colonists' attempts to take places over. I'm not sure, but for blood quantum for indigenous people, that's where it starts, is right there.
And I think you've written extensively about it's a way also to take back land.
Yeah, it was a way, yeah, for them to be like, oh, okay, well, they're no longer now considered natives, so I can purchase this land directly from them. I don't have to go through some other entity that might be like, no, to cut out the power that would be eventually Congress implementing the non-trade acts of like the 1790s up until 1790, well, that are still in effect to today, I think. It was their way of circumnavigating that. It was about stealing land, basically.
So you have a very powerful section in the book where you talk about, one of your characters mentions, blood is blood. Our blood is the same color, and yet we're trying to quantify it.
Yeah.
So this conversation here around blood and who belongs and who doesn't belong really segues into the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980, which features pretty prominently in the book. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and how that affects your characters in Fire Exit.
Yeah, so the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act is garbage. It just is. It's a document that basically just, in my view and in a lot of other people's view, just reaffirms the state's ability to treat us as they had when we were just state recognized. The only difference being that we now have federal recognition, and so we have the trust relationship with the federal government, that can step in. We receive the federal funding, which is not a handout, but is based off of early promises that the federal government, going all the way back to 1823 and a series of court cases, that Chief Justice John Marshall said that natives do not have ownership of the land, but they have a right of occupancy. And it's their responsibility, the federal government's responsibility, to protect them. And basically, like, they explained it as like a ward to a guardian type status. And so people think natives get stuff for free. No, it's the federal government who created it. They said, no, this is our land because you're not Christian. You have a right to it, to occupy it, and we'll protect you. And here's all of these things. So it's the government who did that, so it's not like we're the ones getting benefits. But we got those benefits in 1980 when the Settlement Claims Act came in. We got reimbursed. I think we were given like $85 million, I think. We were given a certain amount of land back, and also the ability to purchase land and then have it be put into trust that the federal government holds, so it's no longer part of like the state of Maine. It's just like we're holding it. But the way it affects the characters is like, in a way, at least I don't think is like visible unless you know intimately the Claims Act and can like bring it to the text. Because I was really more concerned with characters and story and letting the political just be there as a thing that people who know it can be like, oh, well, that's why this is the way it is. And so a lot of readers, I think, have been a bit confused by the book. I think because reading today is a much more, I think, collaborative thing. Like, everybody has their phones and we can Google stuff, and like ideas about how storytelling is like working is changing, I think. And so the book I set out to write was character-driven, story-driven, but under the confines of what I knew shaped these people's lives. And I tried to avoid bringing it in as much as possible, like those political elements, because I wanted to show the effects of these people under the pressure of something that readers may not know about, and force readers to hopefully go out and learn more about it.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Morgan Talty, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Morgan's brand new debut, Fire Exit. We were just talking about the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980, and as a part of that, I really want to expand that conversation to talk about family and what it means. Because I think as you dig in the novel into family, we see there adopted family, right? And then there's blood family. And there's a difference, and yet some of those ties are stronger than others. Talk about how you thought about that in the novel.
Yeah, I've always thought that to love somebody is to love them, whether or not they're your child or they're not your child, whether or not they're your father or they're not your real father. And unconditional love is a thing everybody can attain. We can adopt a child and have them not be biologically related to us and still love them. There are a writer I know who I worked with and was taken from Chile. Up until the 90s, a lot of children were taken from Chile and given to Americans. And so this individual grew up in a white family. They taught themselves Spanish and are reconnecting. But as far as I know, like, they love their actual family. Like, they know, like, they love their mom and dad and the ones that took them, even though it was out of this weird colonial, like, oh, let's take babies from this country and disconnect them and disassociate them. So we can love people who have made mistakes. There are a lot of people who are related to people and they hate each other. They won't talk to each other. And so it's the exact same thing. You have people who are not related by blood but love each other so much they're willing to die for that person, right? It goes both ways. So it's like the biological aspect of it and the genetic aspect of it, in my mind, is equal in weight to the non-biological and the non-genetic connection that we can form, because we're all connected in some way, and in that way, in my view, is emotion. Like, that's the one common denominator amongst us all, is that we can feel, and that's what unites us.
And you see that in Fire Exit. We see that with Charles and his stepfather. He's very close to him. That's his father. But then we see him with his mother, Louise. She is in the throes of dementia, Alzheimer's. And we start to see some stories shift. So Charles thinks that he's grown up one way, but suddenly there are these same questions that he's thinking about in relation to his own daughter. And I thought that was also a fascinating look at family and stories within families and how those can shift over time.
I like the complexity of family histories because we don't always know it all, and they change, and like sometimes you're told stories and they're actually not the real story. It's hard to do in first person because, actually it's not, because you only can see what you can see, you can't get in other people's heads. But like, I liked writing that because it gave an element of suspense, I felt, to the book. It gave that air of like, what's true and what's worth, going back to your earlier question, like, is it worth, telling the truth? This is just an anecdote, but for example, I was doing research for a piece I wrote in Esquire before my book came out, and I went to the tribe to see if I could get access to the census rolls that go all the way back, for way, way, way back. We kept records way before we were recognized, and nobody's allowed to view them except for like two people, whoever's on the census committee, and then perhaps the chief, because there are notes and things on there that are like personal and true things. Somebody could be walking around and they think that their father is Roger, but when in fact there might be a note, their father is actually, their uncle or something like that. And so they document it and it's in there, but it's meant to be kept secret. They're still native through the whole process of it, but they conceal that truth because it could be harmful. Like, imagine learning that you were the product of rape or something like that. What does that do to you? But then at the same time, do you have a right to know? What do we do with these secrets? Are we harming people by keeping them? Or are we harming people by giving them? I have no idea. And that's what Charles is faced with. That's his dilemma. Should we know everything or should we not know everything? Because if stories are what make us fully realized human beings, it kind of seems by that logic that we need to know our stories. We need to know where we came from.
But maybe the story that we've grown up with and the story we know is good enough.
Exactly. And that's the other thing too, is it's like, I always wonder, like, as a reader, after a book's done, I like to adopt the attitude of a reader. I'm like, I wonder what would have happened if it didn't end the way it did. I'm like always curious if things were just left alone. what would that story have looked like?
Yeah, so for listeners, just to give the very brief plot setup, we have Charles is Elizabeth's father, but she doesn't know it. She's grown up thinking that Roger is her father so that she can be raised and a member of the Penobscot Reservation and tribe there. So, the question from the very first page is, should Charles rock her world, change everything she knows now that she's an adult, and tell her that he is her actual biological father?
I'd be terrified if I was in Charles's shoes and had to make that decision.
That's a hard question because she's grown up her whole life, and that really sets up and makes me, as the reader, read the book. There are the politics, there's the interesting part about the land and the Settlement Act and all of these other things. But what I really want to know in this book is, should you tell that secret? And is the family that you have, that you know, that you think you have, is that the best one for you? I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from NHPR. And today my guest is Morgan Talty. We're talking about his brand new debut novel, Fire Exit. We've talked about blood as a theme and family as a theme. We were just talking about this huge overhanging secret in Fire Exit. Should Charles tell his daughter Elizabeth that he is her biological father? And what that really takes us into is the nature of storytelling and memory. This book is really centered on memories of the past, the ways that those memories can affect the future and the present. And this really brings us to Louise, who is Charles' mother. Tell us about her.
Oh, I love her so much. I'm like Bobby in a way. Like Bobby is, this secondary character. He's an alcoholic who Charles met in AA, and Charles got sober, but Bobby didn't, and just drinks, and does his thing. And he meets Louise, and he just automatically just like he loves her very much. That's how I feel. I'm like Bobby. I just very much love Louise. And so she was young when she had Charles, and she had Charles with a man who ended up just scooting and leaving. And Louise's mother had this like racist attitude towards indigenous people of the times, right? And this is in like 1950s, 1940s or so, around that time. And so Louise goes out to the bar and meets this guy who happens to be Frederick, who she ends up marrying. And it doesn't go over well with her mother, who's a non-native and who's white. And there's some stuff that happens to Charles that he didn't know happened to him that he learns later on, which is kind of a neat juxtaposition to think about, right? Knowing the stories that you've never heard. And so Charles has watched her grow up with depression, and after the passing of Frederick, which Louise blames Charles for, they don't talk for a long, long time. Where we pick up in the book, they have already reconnected. There's still tension there, but she's not only suffering from depression, but she's slipping away due to Alzheimer's or dementia. And her ability to tell any sort of truth is limited. And she's sweet, but she's also cruel because of who she thinks she's talking to at times. Like, she begins to think that Charles is Frederick. She'll think that this stuffed animal she has, that, if you give, they encourage you to give patients who have Alzheimer's a baby to care for, like it's a comforting thing. So she has this, it's a stuffed elephant, and she thinks of the stuffed elephant at times. I don't even know sometimes like who she's thinking the stuffed elephant is, if it's Charles and thinking that Charles is the original father, like that abandoned them. And the other thing is, we don't even know about the original father. He could have very well been native. Who knows? That's another thing to think about. We don't know much about him, so we can make assumptions. But she was a fun character to work with. She kind of reminded me of my mom in a lot of ways. Not in that my mom suffered Alzheimer's, but just the way she was, the way she passes away in the book, shared a very similar outline to how I found my own mother. So I care a lot about Louise, and writing Louise, especially that moment towards the end, was me writing how I had experienced losing my mother. So I have a personal relationship with Louise that's connected to my mom, but then I also have like the character Louise, who I adore as a character, even though, there's so many problems she brings to the table. She's funny, she'll make you laugh when you're not supposed to, and it's just, yeah, I loved her.
The detail, the minutia that you describe around dementia, Alzheimer's, being, living with someone like that in your life seemed also very personal. And do I understand that there have been people in your life that you have seen go through this?
Yeah, both my grandmothers suffered from it, and each of them that contributed to their deaths. You know, there's a line in the book that they ask Louise where she is, and she says, "I'm in my bones." Well, that's something my Grammy on my mom's side had said when they asked her. They're like, "Maxine, do you know where you are?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm in my bones." And I'm just like, "Oh my God, that's poetic." And as a writer, I'm always writing stuff down that people say. And sorry, Grammy, I stole that from you, wherever you may be. My dad's mom would in the hospital, you know, I asked where the garbage was once, and she was like, "It's in the kitchen by the refrigerator, but we're not at home." But she's seeing the house there, and so I have experience, you know, in that. But I also research a lot. I always make sure that what I'm writing is accurate. I actually workshopped the Blessing tobacco, which is a Night of the Living Res, which has a Grammy character suffering from Alzheimer's, and there was actually a doctor in the workshop group who was like, you really like you actually like I was scared. I was like, this guy's gonna tell me I did it wrong, or like this doesn't look like an Alzheimer's, somebody suffering from Alzheimer's. But he was like, yeah, for my clinical diagnosis, this is somebody with Alzheimer's. So I've always made sure to do my research on top of my own experience, my own empirical evidence.
My guest today is Morgan Talty. We're talking about his debut novel, Fire Exit. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from NHPR. I want to dig more into Louise and this idea of family because she has a granddaughter, Elizabeth, or Ellie. They don't know about each other, and yet they pass each other in the hall. They're both being treated at the same clinic in the same hospital for depression. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, trying to be mindful of spoilers. They don't know about each other's existence. However, I was talking to a book club and somebody had asked, "Do you think Louise knows that she has a granddaughter?" And part of me wanted to immediately say yes, because there are instances in the book, and I pulled back, but as a reader looking at it, I'm like, I kind of wonder if she knows that she has a granddaughter, but she's not saying anything because she has her own point of view on the subject, right? You know, we don't know what she's thinking. Plus, she's losing her mind, right? She's literally, you know, slipping away. I'm thinking specifically of like the storm moments. There are two storms that hit, two nor'easters that come, and I think it's in there that you get this like sense of like, I wonder if she knows. All I can say is she is quite alone, but at the same time, she's not. Like she has all these memories she's living with, and all these people who are like dead and gone that have come back to life to her, you know, in the form of Charles, in the form of this stuffed elephant. She's like alone, but she's not at the same time, which I think again is this like representation of like belonging, right? Like who do we have in our corner? Sometimes we seems like we don't, but we do. And sometimes it seems like we do, but we don't. And that's like Louise's, you know, situation.
You also have this line in relation to these two characters, Elizabeth and Louise. You are who you are, even if you don't know it.
Yeah.
And that just really hit home for me because I assume they don't know about each other, that Louise doesn't know about Elizabeth. But you are who you are, even if you don't know it.
Yeah.
That was so powerful.
Well, yeah, thank you. And it's true, right? Like we can think we know who we are, but it takes somebody else's viewpoint to sometimes reveal our true selves to ourselves. Like we can't look objectively at ourselves. So thank you for that praise on that line.
My guest today is Morgan Talty. We're talking about his debut novel, Fire Exit. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from NHPR. I absolutely love this novel. It got me thinking about so many things at the same time. And one of the themes that I keep coming back to is this idea of what is the right story? Is there even such a thing as a right story? And one of the ways that Morgan really digs into this idea in the novel is a story that's told in two different ways of two men standing on a porch. There's a gun, or maybe two guns, depending on which version you believe, and a lot of backstory. Morgan, can you tell us about that moment in the book?
Yeah, from whose point of view do you want? Do you want Bobby's or do you want Charles or do you just want overview of that incident?
I mean, I think the real question, it gets to that, your question there, to my question, gets to this idea, we're getting very meta here,
Yeah.
of what is the real story?
Yeah.
And whose story do we even want to hear?
Yeah, yeah. So we have, I mean, in this, so just to add some context here, you know, we have another character we haven't talked about, which is Jesus and his father, Leno. And Leno is the chief of the Penobscot Nation and has been the chief. And Gizus, in Penobscot, Gizus means both sun and moon. And so it's like, yeah, I explained that in the book. But Gizus and Charles are best friends growing up. They absolutely are. Leno is a very violent man, and he's an alcoholic, and his wife was gone. We don't really know, right? Like, she left, and, Gizus wonders why she didn't take him with her, and, lots of questions he has, right, about stories that are not accessible to him. He can't get access to. But Gizus, eventually we learn he's gay. He loves men. And Leno ultimately finds these pornographic pictures, and his response as an angry, violent person is he beats him, just beats him brutally. There's a saying when in boarding schools, when natives went to boarding schools, kill the Indian to save the man, or like, kill the Indian to save the child, or something like that. And in this instance, we're looking at a native person hurting another native person, a family member, a son, right? Basically, kill the gayness to save the Indian, right? I guess you could phrase it that way, right? Like, let's beat it out of him. I don't know. Like, that was Leno's response to it. And so ultimately what happens is we wind up with Frederick, who is, again, Charles's stepfather, going over because he finds out what happened. He finds out that Leno had done this. And Frederick doesn't get along with Leno because the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act is going on. And Frederick is constantly, in everybody's ear being like, no, we deserve more, we deserve more, we deserve more. And so Leno's like already sick of him anyways. And plus he has a son he adopted who's white, so that gives another reason not to like him. Like, that's just his character, Leno's character. And so we end up with Frederick holding a gun at Leno because of this situation, and we see Gizus, who's like beaten, and Leno and everybody's coming out of their houses, and Bobby tells the story because he had an aunt Mary who dated somebody and watched it, and says that there were two guns and they both shot each other and all this stuff. And then Charles tells the story, and it's Leno basically turns the whole narrative around to basically say that Charles was the one who had beaten Gizus because Gizus was gay, and that he called Charles gay, and that Gizus was not gay, and that since Gizus was not gay, and that Charles couldn't get sexually as a boy out of this other boy something, he beat him, right? And that becomes this narrative. And who do you believe, right? The reader, I think, has a good sensibility, but the characters themselves, that's where we put the emphasis should be put. Well, what do they think, right? It's not about what we think, it's about what these characters think. And then our thinking about them, what they know and what they don't know, how do we think about that in our own lives? So yeah, we have these two men who are there. We have some fact, but then we have just different memories of made up stuff and lies and truth, and like how do we separate them? How do we weave through all of the BS that comes our way? And there's a lot of it, especially in politics, not just in just our general lives, but like in the political sphere. Like, we never know who's saying the truth. I've just come to accept everything that everybody says is a lie. Like in like certain sections of like politics, I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, whatever.
But in the novel too, right? It's what is true. We don't know, and maybe it doesn't matter because you are who you are, and that's what matters.
Yeah.
So I want to talk for a minute about Bobby. He's sort of a side character. He meets Charles in AA, but he remains an alcoholic throughout the book. As you mentioned, he loves Louise, Charles's mother. He has an important presence, but he's also really kind of a side character. But I understand you think that the entire novel would fall apart without Bobby. And so I've been dying to ask you why. Why is Bobby so important in this book?
Because Bobby is, for me, like, I'm not like, do you find Bobby funny? Like, do you find him as like a funny character?
I thought he was funny.
Yeah, like, even though he's a train wreck, like the train wrecks he brings to moments where there's already a train wreck, like, bring you to the point where you like have to laugh at like, well, this is just like too absurd. Like I've just been in situations like that.
Right. Did he really just do that? Did he really just do that? That's what I kept thinking.
Yeah, you're like, it's like, Bobby, why? Yeah, like, Bobby, why would you do that when you know better? And he was like, "Ah, shoot, or whatever. And without him, without that sort of comedic element, like, and I never used, I didn't create him to be funny. I didn't, that wasn't what I was setting out to do, but I recognized the opportunity that he was bringing to the table a sort of lightness against this dark, heavy material, right? Like when we would encounter, the dark, right? I've always heard that if you can make somebody laugh, they will follow you anywhere. And that includes hell itself. Like, and so Bobby is like that sort of representation for me. Like, without Bobby, there's not much left. There's not really a lot to laugh at unless you have a sixth sense of humor like I do. And you might laugh at like moments of Elizabeth getting scared of like this thing as a child, the elephant thing. But Bobby is an essential part of the story. And I don't know why, but as a writer, I sometimes I find my secondary characters more interesting than I do my primary characters. Is very weird, but yeah, that's my reasoning. Is that he is the relief. When the balloon gets too full, he's the one who deflates it a little bit, even though he's adding fuel to the fire. It's a very weird, contradictory thing, but he somehow is able to do that.
You're listening to Check This Out from NHPR. My guest today is Morgan Talty, and we are talking about his brand new debut, Fire Exit. Morgan, I want to shift the conversation a little bit to the writer's life. And I understand that you started this book in 2017, but it sold in 2022 and had a lot of drafts along the way. Can you tell us about that process?
The idea actually came to me in 2015, actually very quickly, in a matter of 40 seconds. I was like, oh, what if this non-native guy has a baby with a woman who's a quarter blood and then she lies to get the child on the census? And that's the inciting incident that would start the story, put it into movement, and then I'd have to figure the rest out. I didn't start writing it though until 2017, and I wrote, yeah, I think the book that's out now is the sixth rewrite. So I rewrote the book 6 times from scratch because I've written 4 other novels. Just you have to get them out. They're all bad, like unrelated to this. They're terrible. And I'd run the marathon, right? I'd run the marathon before, but this time I really did it. And it's not a marathon. It's a race you sign up for that doesn't tell you when it ends. And for everybody it's different. So I started writing it in 2017. I wrote a first draft. I had an agent and I rewrote it again, and they read it, said it reminded them of Marilyn Robinson, but that they didn't end up finish reading it, the whole thing. And so I fired that agent and moved on, and I just kept rewriting the book. I had friends read it, and I mean, the first draft was 450 pages, third person omniscient, all over the place. Second draft, same thing, rewrite of third person. I mean, so I have like, I don't even know, 2,000 pages of like not material. Like,
And the published book is only like 230 pages, just to give listeners an idea.
yeah, it's funny because like I remember things about this book that are not in the book. Like scenes, I see Mary in her house with Roger in bed because like I've written that. It was a multiple perspective novel at one point, but eventually I was like, I found myself, coming back to your original question about like, why did you choose a white first person from a white person's point of view? And I was like, well, that's where the story is, right? Like the story isn't anywhere else. Like you can't tell this story from inside the community because the story is supposed to be kept secret, right? Mary's not going to say nothing. Roger's not going to say nothing if he knows. Elizabeth doesn't know. Nobody knows. So it has to default to Charles. And I had a whole draft of him actually like telling this story to a boy, a neighbor. And then that even was like, no, I'm looking the wrong way. I have to look across the river. And once I figured that out, it was much easier to rewrite that last sixth draft because I knew everybody. I knew them well enough, like I knew them in real life, like had grown up with them because I'd written so much about them. When you write a novel, you have 20 balls you have to juggle. And that's why rewriting allows you to put the balls down until you're left with like one, you know? And that's easy enough to just toss up and down. And I can't even juggle, so that's bad metaphor. Yeah, so it was 5 years of writing the book and then doing edits also with Maisie Cochran, who is a brilliant editor at Tin House. And we did edits on that for, about a year because my wife and I had our first son on the way. So we were like, all right, we got to get ahead of the game here because probably not going to be doing much revision during this period. And yeah, we sold it to Tin House in 2022. And then we worked on it from then until 2023 when my son was born in February. And then it came out the year later.
So when you were doing these early drafts back, you had the idea 2015, 2017, you have your full first draft. Were you working simultaneously on the short stories that became Night of the Living Res?
I was, yeah. My main focus was actually the collection, and I was doing both though. I think just because my process of like writing short stories, like it usually takes me about 5 to 7 days to finish a short story.
That's fast.
Is it? See, I hear stories about Anton Chekhov sitting down and taking a bath and writing like a perfect story, and I'm just like, well, that's helpful.
I mean, if you're Chekhov, maybe.
Yeah, that's sort of my process, and on average, and so like knowing that, I was able to account for like when I could squeeze in novel writing, and they were two distinctly different stories, and it allowed me to do it that way. I don't know if I'd again be able to do work on both at the same time, but I did give more attention to the collection than I did to the novel when it came to spending time with it. Like the story collection too has hundreds and hundreds of pages that are not in the collection.
So this is NHPR, and you are a Dartmouth grad. Dartmouth was founded to educate, they say, Native American youth and others, and to train Native Americans to become Christian missionaries. So how did it feel to be at Dartmouth? Do you think about that?
It's interesting because I went to Dartmouth at a time when things had changed drastically. They had sent Samson Occam, who was like the poster white missionary boy, and sent him all around England to collect money to raise funds to start this school that, like you said, was for the purpose of educating natives. But between its founding in like 1970 or so, not even like 20 or something natives had graduated from it. The rest were all non natives. I'm pretty sure it's a similar situation to Harvard, too. But I think it was 1970 when they admitted women to the college, they also reaffirmed their commitment to the original mission of educating Native Americans. Since then, so many Native people have graduated, but there's still like systemic racism, I think, at Dartmouth that affects Native students, be it policy-wise, be it against the Department of Native American Studies. So my experience was okay, it was fine. I actually transferred from a community college to Dartmouth because I was a terrible student because I didn't have the greatest upbringing. I got denied from Maine, which now I'm a professor at, which is funny. But like my experience at Dartmouth was just, I love the academics, but I felt on the outside of seeing so many people who were very privileged and parents were congressmen or had been former congressmen and things like that. And I'm just like, my mom once shot at kids with a BB gun. Like that's my life versus, theirs. Yeah, but even those students, like it doesn't matter. Even if they're at a level of privilege, they also have had to suffer through strange circumstances. The stories I've heard about what parents have made their children do, I'm just like kind of glad I grew up the way, like I feel like I escaped something maybe. As Jane Austen said, one does not love a place the less for having suffered in it, unless it's been all suffering, nothing but suffering. We all know what it's like to suffer, and that is the point, right? It's not about who has the most suffrage. It's the fact that we all know what it is and that we are here to lean on one another at the end of the day. Like that's the thing that unites us. That's the thing that is going to heal us, is our ability to recognize and celebrate our differences, right? But know that we are all ultimately unified.
You're a professor at the University of Maine. What do you tell people who are new writers or aspiring writers or your students? What kind of advice do you have for them about writing?
My recent saying has been, you need to write, you need to not worry about business side of writing. You need to write. Failure does not exist when you're on the side of being an artist. The business side, sure. failure, the idea of failure exists. But when you're writing for the sake of art, you are basically like, yeah, sure, if you pump out 30 pages that it's nothing, I compare it to this. Each page you write is just a mile on the odometer in the car that you're driving towards the city that is the story. And in this metaphor, I will make clear there are no carbon emissions. You have to go that distance to get to your destination. So don't be discouraged if you write a 450-page book that sucks. Start over. All that means is you pulled over to take a quick little break and get back on the road, okay? That's what I tell them. And it's hard work. It is hard work, but you have to do it.
I mean, I hear from established writers, too, who are in their 5th, 6th, 7th novel. Sometimes they'll write a 400-page book, give it to their agent, and the agent's like, put it in the drawer, move on to the next one.
Yeah, it's hit or miss. It's
brutal.
It really is. You don't know what you will end up with. Yeah, you end up in a shoddy town when you were not supposed to be there. You know what I mean? You're aiming for Vegas or something, or you're aiming for New York City, or in that metaphorical way. You end up in the wrong place, and you put it in the drawer. But sometimes years later, you go back and you're like, wait, maybe I just took a detour. Maybe I am onto something, which is why I always say also, don't get rid of your work. Save it, even the bad stuff. Don't read it all the time because you'll feel bad about yourself, but keep it. It's valuable.
So when readers are done reading Fire Exit, what do you want them to walk away with? What do you want them thinking about?
I want them thinking about these characters. I want them to think about how they affected them. I also want people who feel unaffected by the characters in this story to consider why they may feel unaffected by it. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with thinking more about the community in the context of its history, right? That's not in the book, that I deliberately did not put in the book. As one reviewer wrote, this is not recliner reading. This is a book you have to engage with as a book, but in conversation with documents that are out there, like the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act, like my essay I wrote on blood quantum, like federal Indian law. It's really a call to look deeper into Indigenous communities in the way they're structured, the way they're set up, while also being just an entertaining story, I hope. That's my goal. If I succeeded, I succeeded. If I failed, I failed. That's up to other people to decide. So ultimately, in the end, I always want my work to bring us closer together. That's my main objective, is to make us love one another and care for one another more than we had before we had read the book. That's my main thing, because that's the only thing that's going to save us all. Compassion and empathy and care.
Morgan Talty, thank you so much for joining me today on Check This Out.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me. I was very excited to talk about this, and I'm so glad we got to talk about a range of topics about Fire Exit.
Me too. I can't wait to read whatever you put out next. You've been listening to Check This Out, a series which is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. We dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. Our producer today is Jessica Hunt. The Howe Library Director is Ruby Simon. NHPR's Program Director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation and the Howe Library Corporation. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and we'll be back next week at this same time with more conversations. Remember to go to your local library and check out all the books you hear about and love here on the show. Or go to your local bookstore and buy a copy. Thanks for listening.